with SLU Global, addressing this very urgent and important question regarding the food system and the effects of food security and nutrition of COVID-19. So I'm hoping, it's a breakfast session, so please feel free to, enjoy your cup of coffee or tea, or since you're muted, please eat or snack whatever you want, because we're going to talk about food and food security, and I want to make sure that you all are set. So the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has had a major impact on the global food system and the food security. So the pandemic has jeopardized people's access to food, and especially the healthy food. And it has also been a global economic slowdown that we don't even know the end of yet. And the pandemic has really highlighted the weaknesses of the food system, and that's a part of what we're going to talk about today. So how can we reduce, or at least build a more resilient food system, focusing on the effects that the COVID-19 have kind of pointed out for us, or highlighted the areas? So we need to urgently look at food security for the global population and build a long-term resilient food system. This is nothing new, but it's more visible perhaps at the moment when we are all challenged with this pandemic. So in a new publication from the UN's Committee on World Food Security and the high-level panel of experts, they published an issue paper, and that is what we're going to focus on today. And the title is Impacts of COVID-19. I had to read this. On food security and nutrition, developing effective policy responses to address the hunger and malnutrition pandemic. So the purpose with this paper was to provide the insights addressing the food and nutrition security implications of the COVID-19. But it was also thought of as an input to the UN's 2021 Food System Summit that will take place in September next year. So I think that's the important part also that I want to highlight and address to every one of you, that it's a lot of activities going on in gathering information for that summit. So this morning we have 3 guests with us, except for everyone else of you that we're going to talk. And first I'd like to welcome Shakuntala Tilsted. She's one of the authors to this issue paper, and she's also a member of the Committee of the World Food Security's high-level panel of experts. And let's see here, you're a research program leader for value chain and nutrition at World Fish, and you're stationed in Malaysia. And you're an honorary doctor at SLU. After Shakuntala, we will have reflections and comments by Kajsa Johansson, Senior Advisor at We Effect and Vi Skogen. And then we have Sophia Bokvist, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Biomedical Science and Veterinary Public Health at SLU. But I will start by leaving, I was going to say floor, but it's not. It's a space, it's an endless space, I can tell us. So take it, please.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie. And I'm really happy that you brought in the links to the UN Food Systems Summit. Because some of the work that we talk about here, I will also want to bring into that forum, because I'm the vice chair of the Action Track 4 on equitable livelihoods, advancing equitable livelihoods, which is in a way a little bit different because much of the summit focuses on food, but this one action track focuses on the people. It's more people-centered. So thanks for bringing that up. Thank you so much, Karen. So, as Anne-Sophie mentioned, I am calling in from Penang in Malaysia, where I'm based, because the World Fish, which is one of the CGIAR centers, has its headquarters in Penang. I'm also one of the 15 members of the steering committee of the high level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. And this paper that I'm presenting today, or my presentation today, is based solely on the HLP issues paper. And one thing that I think it's important to note is that the COVID-19 pandemic is quite rather fluid, as you all know. And this paper came out in September 2020. So there have been changes and different trajectories, which we had not seen at that time. The title of this issues paper is called Impacts of COVID-19 on Food Security and Nutrition, because that's the Committee on Food Security and Nutrition that we work through. And it's called Advancing the Hunger and Malnutrition Pandemic. Next slide, please. So I've built up this presentation on an introduction and looking at the global picture as to how COVID-19 is affecting food security and nutrition, and then present the recommendations and conclusions that can all be found in the issues paper. Next slide, please. So if we look at the overall picture, what have we seen and how has COVID-19 pandemic progressed up to now? So we've seen that the situation is very fluid and dynamic, and it's just not unidirectional. It goes forward, and perhaps in some areas, some region, it regresses back to where it was from time before. If we would look at the state of the food security and nutrition report that came out in 2020. They did a revision in June of 2020, and their revision estimates that between 100 to 120 million people will be added to the ranks of the world's hungry in 2020. There have been different estimates and different think tanks who look at these estimates and prognosis and come up with their own as well. So if you look at the World Bank estimates, they talk about that up to 115 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty in 2020. And looking at 2021, they estimate that this would rise to 150 million people. These are in addition to the normal prognoses. IFPRI, which is the International Food Policy Research Institute, one of another CGIAR centers, estimates that there will be an increase of 100 million people experiencing chronic hunger and extreme poverty alone in 2020. And we do know that before the pandemic struck, that the estimate was that over 3 billion people around the globe could not afford to have healthy diets. And therefore, we now know with the pandemic that this number of 3 billion would increase this year and in the years to come. And therefore, there's an urgent need to make sure that the food systems we have are more resilient and more sustainable in the face of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So if we would look at how, at the global level, how COVID-19 is affecting food security and nutrition. And you start to the left of this slide with in the red, the pandemic COVID-19, and go all the way to the effects we see on food and nutrition security and poverty. So from the estimates I gave you, everything is pointing towards increased poverty and increased food and nutrition insecurity. But if you would look in the middle at the pathways, it's pretty complex and it's not that easy to disentangle. And the one leads to the other, and it's not unidirectional. You can have forward pathways and backward pathways, but we do know that in the end, that there are estimates of increasing number of people suffering from poverty and food and nutrition insecurity. If you would take one of the more common pathways that we saw from the beginning, when countries started reacting and coming up with responses to the COVID-19. So there were many policies with respect to lockdowns, with respect to movements, transportation, which disrupted supply chains of food and thereby had a direct effect on food prices and food and nutrition insecurity, especially for the poor and vulnerable. Next slide, please. So a traditional framework was used in this issues paper where when you deal with emergencies. So normally the traditional framework is that you move from an initial phase, in this case we use 1 to 2 months, to a medium term phase of 2 to 6 months, and then a longer term phase. We now know from September to now that perhaps this traditional framework doesn't fit that well with the COVID pandemic, because we saw that some countries and regions moved from an initial to a medium term phase, but then in some areas they went back to initial phases in certain population groups. And with respect to the longer term prognosis and what kind of framework we would use in terms of time period, I wonder, I mean, here we've said 6 to 24 months, but I wonder how long this longer term would stretch out to. Perhaps now with vaccinations, it's going to be another kind of disruption, but we just don't know. So we know that, as I mentioned, that in the beginning with the lockdowns, there were disruption to supply chains, there were disruption to inputs of production, especially in countries where inputs come from imports of inputs, and that has greatly affected the food systems and affected the supplies of different types of foods to different population groups. Next slide, please. So the Committee on Food Security and Nutrition is this overall body that works at international level. And if I'm sure most of you know about this, and up to this year, 2020, when we talked about the different dimensions of food and nutrition security, we used 4 dimensions as portrayed here in the middle of the diagram, being the 4 being access, availability, stability, and utilization. This year, the CFS, with the workings of the HLP, has recommended, and it's now enacted in the new report, the report number 15, that these 4 dimensions of food security and nutrition should be expanded to 6, with the 2 extras being agency of people. For example, how do people work together in organizations, in associations, and how does this affect food security and nutrition? And the 6th dimension being sustainability. An example of where sustainability plays a great role is, for example, in reducing loss and waste of foods, because at a global level, it is estimated that up to 1/3 of all food produced is lost. Next slide, please. So what I presented before is how you would look at a global level. Now, if you would look at a household level in terms of household capital and the household portfolio, we know that households rely on many types of, on an array of portfolio and capital in order to cope, in order to ensure that food and nutrition security is met. These capitals include social, natural, physical, financial, and human capital. And of course, it can be leaned to one or the other or to a combination of these types of household capital. However, we've seen with the pandemic, with the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially for the rural populations and the rural poor, that there is a greater tendency for a reliance on natural capitals, such as the land, water, the agroforestry, wild foods. And we see this also because we've seen in many countries, especially low and middle income countries, that with the start of the pandemic and with the shutdown, you had vast numbers of people moving back from cities and urban centers back into rural settings. Next slide, please. So with respect to the recommendations that are given in the issues paper for COVID-19 responses, these recommendations build on the HLPE report number 15, which is a more longer term view of meeting of food and nutrition security, and it takes into consideration very much meeting the goals of this meeting the sustainable development goals up to 2030, and therefore there is not much new except for perhaps the pace and the intensity that's needed to face the responses of the COVID-19, but the recommendations build very much on this global narrative. Next slide, please. So if you would look at how the recommendations came about, and if we start from the right-hand corner with the Sustainable Development Goals up to 2030, which is but not the ultimate, because I mean, many of us are going to live longer than 2030 and the world is going to be there after 2030. But if we take the point of departure with the Sustainable Development Goals up to 2030, then there has been, with respect to food security and nutrition, there is a greater focus on the SDG 2, which is zero hunger and combating malnutrition in all its forms. And then taking into consideration the 6 dimensions of food and nutrition security, that this theory of changes to how you get there in terms of the responses to COVID-19 build on 4 policy elements that stem out of the longer term recommendations of meeting the goals of 2030. So these policy elements talk about the recognition for the transformation of food systems, as we've all talked about. It also takes into consideration that food security and nutrition is a system that does not belong to just one sector, as in the past we would talk about the agricultural sector, but it is intertwined with many different sectors. For example, education, nutrition and health, transportation. And we do know also that it's not only about the quantity of food, but it's also the quality in terms of nutrition quality and the safety of foods, because SDG 2 not only focuses on hunger, but malnutrition in all its forms. So this takes into consideration also micronutrient deficiencies, obesity, and overweight. And we saw some of the examples I gave. So if you would look at different contexts and different population groups, we do know that the solutions we need to find in order to respond to the food and nutrition insecurity that we are seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic, that they have to be context specific and context specific for different geographies and different population groups. As you would, I'm sure you know, if you would find solutions for the urban poor, these solutions will be quite different from the solutions you would need for the rural poor. Next slide, please. So based on the issues paper and the long-term recommendations stemming out of this test, stemming from the global narrative up to 2030. 6 specific recommendations were described in the issues paper with respect to responses to COVID-19. And the first of this is with respect to social protection programs. I mentioned at the very beginning how many people we know that the ranks of those who are poor, those who are food insecure, those who cannot afford healthy diets, that these numbers would swell. And one of the ways, instant ways of tackling this problem will be through social protection programs. And the recommendations call for, not just as we have done many times in the past with emergency situations and shocks, just looking at the quantity of food, but also looking at the quality of food and ensuring that the social protection programs, food rations, take into consideration healthy and nutritious foods. The second recommendation is that we do not just talk about the foods for the people, but we also talk about the people who are engaged in the food systems and who work with the food systems to ensure that these foods reach reach on the plates of especially the poor and vulnerable. So the workers and the farmers, they need better protection, and this should be ensured through the way the food systems are set up and the way that we change the food systems. There are many countries that reply that there are many countries that depend a lot on food imports. If you would just go to the Pacific and small island states, in order for them to get healthy and nutritious diets, they depend on food imports. So there's need to make sure that there's protection of food imports, especially to these country and population groups that depend on food imports for their food and nutrition security. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So if we continue with the recommendations, the fourth recommendations talk about policy responses with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, this here is not new because at the global level and at national level, we have many recommendations, policies, and guidelines, starting with the right to food. But in many countries and many parts of the world, these are not enacted as yet. So this response to COVID-19 puts us at a much greater need to ensure that these policies and recommendations and guidelines are taken on board, both at a global level and at a country and subnational level. The fifth is depending on the dependence we have on diverse and resilient distribution systems of food. So in recent times, we have become more used in our food systems to having, for example, longer supply chains and more importance given to longer supply chains, perhaps less given to shorter supply chains and the use of having at national and subnational level, small scale and medium enterprises being a greater part of the food systems. And that one of the things that COVID-19 has taught us, and which we know also from other shocks, that the shorter supply chains can make the systems more diverse and resilient. And continuing in that frame, the last recommendation is about resilient food production systems based on agroecology and based on other sustainable forms of food production. For example, it's not just production of food on land, but it's the foods that stem out of both water and land landscapes. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, as I've described, we've seen that COVID-19 started off as an unexpected shock. It has grown in its consequences, and therefore the responses we need are now very multivariate. And if we would look at what effect it has had on our food systems, it has exposed the flaws that we have in our food systems. And in some areas and some parts of the world, it has crippled the existing food systems. So if we want to have responses, we need to both change the flaws and we need to loosen and have food systems that have different dimensions. And we do know that if we take into consideration the overall picture of where we were and our overall global aims, we were very much looking to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, and especially SDG 2, which targets zero hunger and removing all forms of malnutrition. So COVID-19 is one of many shocks. It is the shock now that we are all occupied with, but we do know that in the future there will be more shocks to come, different types of shocks to come. And how has COVID-19 taught us and is teaching us to take into consideration and to have smart and innovative responses to shocks? And how is it helping us to build resilience for the future? I'd like to take the last slide to show just an example of what we at WorldFish is doing with respect to the COVID-19 responses. So WorldFish work is focused on aquatic food systems. And aquatic food systems are important for many countries around the world. If you would take the Pacific where we work, the Bangladesh, and the deltas, the Mekong Delta here where we are also. So we've started looking at the supply chains and how the impacts of COVID-19 have affected aquatic food supply chains. And we're doing both quantitative and qualitative assessments on the food value chains, aquatic food value chains. We've also created a dashboard to provide high frequency data and information for policy interventions. And we are working quite closely with governments and with other international organizations such as FAO and IFAD with respect to responses. And if you'd like to learn more about our responses within the sphere of aquatic food systems, please do contact us. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Shakuntala. I wish we could all applaud, like we would do if we were meeting. So yay, I can see that, some hands up. Excellent. Very good. Thanks. I'm sure we have a lot of questions, but I'd like to move on and give Kajsa and Sophia a chance to put in their reflections also, so we could have an even more dynamic discussion as we go along. So please, Kajsa, the space is yours.
Thank you very much, Ann-Sophie, and thank you very much, Shakuntala, for a really interesting presentation, on also bringing on board some interesting facts and figures that were not in the report, I believe, on the livelihoods, for example. I think that was particularly interesting. As we affect and via agroforestry, we can definitely confirm the picture that the report paints on the COVID-19 crisis being more of a hunger pandemic in many of the countries where we work. I do think that it's also really important what the report highlights, that the hunger crisis was actually ongoing already before the COVID-19. As you point out in the report, that we had negative figures on food security since 2014. And I think that's really important to remember also when we talk about responses, that we actually had a system that wasn't actually functioning for a very large part of the world's population before COVID-19. And as the agroforestry and we affect, we are also very happy to see that you include the sustainable agriculture production in the recommendations, and the importance of agroecology and inclusive forestry, as well as the importance of social security for smallholder farmers and food system workers. I'm really happy, and we're really happy also about, like what you mentioned, about adding agency to how we view food security, the different dimensions. And I think that is also seen in the recommendations, where you highlight the importance of the participation, the active participation and influence of smallholder farmers, both in access to markets, but also fairer markets, to be able to benefit, not just to get there, but also to benefit and have a fairer participation. One thing that I also found interesting in the report is the formality bias that you write about. I think we have seen it, but we haven't really framed it in the way that it's framed in the report. And I think it's very telling that outdoor informal markets have been closed down, but indoor formal markets and shopping centers have been kept open, and how this is striking very differently, both to consumers and to producers, as both the consumers and the producers of the informal markets are the poorer people. So I think that it's also it's an interesting picture to elaborate upon. And I think that for many of the countries where we work, that is really the case. And that's also part of the reason why the COVID pandemic has struck so hard on the poorer population. And our two organizations, I mean, for us, the leaving no one behind perspective is one of the strongest policy tools that we have right now, really putting the focus on the most marginalized. And of course, this is a global report, but I would like to point out some perspectives of the leaving no one behind approach, if we read the report with those eyes. For example, the indigenous people and traditional knowledge, which we believe as a knowledge, it's really important to consider in the analysis, but also in recommendation. And looking at indigenous people in many countries in the world, they are heavily overrepresented among the food insecure. So we believe that this is an important category across the globe. I mean, we can see the differences in Canada, in Guatemala, in many parts of the world, to take into consideration, as they are a specifically vulnerable group, but also a really important group in terms of food production and ecosystem management. So it would be interesting to hear, like Shakuntala, you discussing this a bit, like how you view that in the light of the report. Another perspective regard the gender and women's roles, and you write about it in the report, but it's not so very present in the recommendations. I'm sure there've been battles around recommendations, but that would also be really interesting if we look, for example, at the question of social protection of women. They are overrepresented in the informal sector, in the food system, along the food supply chain. And their work is unseen and informal, and they tend to be outside. Even where we have the social security, they tend to be left out from that. And also the question on harmful gender norms that were there before. I mean, women were more in food insecure before and have been more hardly hit. So that would also be interesting, also from a leaving no one behind perspective, focusing on, I mean, women is definitely not a specific group, but also to try to segment the analysis. And a third perspective would be the conflict perspective, since, I mean, if we look like WFP, for example, they state that living in a long-term violent conflict is the single most important reason to acute hunger. And we can see that, I mean, the situations in, for example, DRC, Congo, Yemen, and Afghanistan are even more severe than in many other parts of the world. And as you said in your presentation, Shakuntala, there's, I think that, and also in the report, it really, like the COVID-19 crisis, it really highlights the flaws of the existing system. And I mean, reading the recommendations, it's easy get a bit like feel overwhelmed, because they actually recommend us to do more than we were able to do before, but with probably much less resources. We see how in general, like high income countries close, they look more inwards, development cooperation is reducing. And at the same time, in the recommendations, we assume things, for example, the existence of social security systems that were not there before COVID to 70% of the world's population. And now we want to enforce them. But in many parts where the most vulnerable live, they have to be built. I think also one good illustration of this is the school lunches, which is a really powerful tool to ensure like one healthy meal a day to children. But then we also know that the majority of the world's children didn't enjoy school lunches before COVID, and the children of the poorest families are not in school and do not have access. So it's like overwhelming to see what we have to work with to build back better. And as I said, with much less resources. And I think that also relates to what like this relation like to the Food System Summit and the engagement of different countries in that. I got a bit worried when we heard during the last meeting of the FAO committee that poorer countries' governments are not as engaged as rich countries. And then one might wonder, like, where do we go with this summit to solve the problems where they are most severe? And as we agroforestry and we affect, I mean, we are also working on like not just in relation to the Food System Summits, but to actually put agriculture on the development cooperation agenda, which is a bit of a challenge, despite the picture that I think that the picture of the situation of the world that I think we all agree on. I mean, if we look at development cooperation to agriculture, also, of course, agreeing completely that it's not a sector, but we also need to look at like, what are we actually investing in food production? I mean, 2.6% of the Swedish development cooperation goes to agriculture and food production. And that appears as a very, very small figure looking at, and also taking this leave no one behind perspective, and also looking at the challenge that we have ahead of us. So I think that we have several colleagues here involved in Agrofosé, and also, of course, CGR involved in like making like research like more accessible to small, like having an impact. But I also think, and I'm involved in several discussions on like development cooperation, I also think that we need researchers to be involved in like in the defense of like that kind of an engagement, so that we actually have the resources to implement this. So I think that is also, it goes maybe one step beyond, but we need this information, we need the facts on the table also to, as a general defense, to actually not just look inside Sweden, inside Europe. I mean, I think the vaccine discussion is very telling. We're guaranteeing it for us, and there is no mentioning of what is happening outside our borders. So I think we have a big challenge ahead of us. But thank you very much for a very interesting report and a very interesting presentation, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kajsa.
Thank you, Kajsa. I think there were some questions directly to you, Shakuntala. Would you like to jump in and comment on them at this point? Oh,
yes.
Oh, that was a lot easier to hear you then. Yeah.
So, Kajsa, thank you. There are many points which I recognize, and also that you raised that gives nearly not, doesn't give, it's more give more frustrations than hope, I think. I mean, if I take into consideration again the Food Systems Summit, and the role I play as one of the chair for Action Track 4, really, really very frustrated as to the representation of diverse governments within and the low income countries, the middle income countries. It's the representation is very poor. And I was just just the other day, I was talking about agroforestry in Nepal and some of the solutions that we've seen in Nepal with respect to agroforestry. It would be great if I could have representations from Nepal and other countries on board that bring these solutions and show how they can be scaled up and how they can form part of the solutions we need. You brought up this about leaving no one behind. That's a very, very fundamental principle, and I try very much to tie that in with starting with the right to food, which Sweden has worked a lot with. I mean, all the Nordic countries have been really great proponents of the right to food, and within that, the concept of leaving no one behind. The other, I think, frustrating part is this about not putting indigenous knowledge to use. Indigenous populations are the stewards of the diversity we have with respect to, with respect to the food systems, with respect to diverse foods and diverse, not only land foods, but foods from not only foods that we produce on land through agriculture, but from the waters, from the forests. And this knowledge, again, if we would have better representation of the indigenous peoples within, for example, the Food Summit, it would be great. I do not know, I've been thinking about it, if one of the issues is that there's a lack of investment and capital to ensure, because there are so few people who can get a place at the table. How do we ensure that there are seats reserved for certain groups that have so much to bring? You talked about women. In their role, not only in terms of food producers, but also the role they play or the role they have within family structures and within societies, and how now with the pandemic we see even more insecurity, food and nutrition insecurity among women and among adolescent girls. If I would take some of the data that I see coming out of the countries we work with in Asia, we can see clearly that already with the pandemic, there are changes, and their situation has gotten worse. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Shakuntala, if it's, I think, so many interesting aspects of this discussion, but if it's okay, I would like to invite Sophia to give her reflections also, and then we get another dimension into this discussion. So please, Sophia.
Thank you very much, and good morning and good afternoon also to all of you. I was very happy to be invited to give some comments on this report, and I have put on my SLU glasses as I will represent SLU on this event. And first of all, SLU, I would like to acknowledge a very nice report, and thank you, Shakuntala, for a very nice presentation. I read it with great interest, really. So SLU, we have a strong commitment in engaging in global research and capacity building together with our global partners to contribute to food security. And as has been mentioned, this is more important than ever during this COVID pandemic we are facing now. So our work is really highlighted, and that is good, I think. And the report mentions that COVID pandemic has profound implications on food security and also nutrition. And I was happy to see that nutrition was particularly emphasized. It's not just about counting calories, also about the quality and nutrition of the food. And Shakuntala also mentioned malnutrition and micronutrient deficiency, which is also called hidden hunger. So you can say that there is more than ever important to support the transformation of current food production system to be more productive and sustainable, and to prevent the further disruptions of the system. And today, almost 70% of the calories consumed in low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they are produced by smallholders, often livestock farmers. And there is thus an emphasis to support this small-scale farming during the pandemic, so they can produce both for themselves and also surplus that can be sold on local markets, as we have seen disruption of the more global and longer supply chains. It was interesting to see the recommendations in the report. Let's go down. The recommendations on having more shorter supply chain and more focus on the territorial, the local markets. That could be a way of decreasing dependence on food imports. I think that is very interesting, and it will require firm political decisions, as it would require that farmers that produce for the global markets instead are encouraged to produce for the local or territorial markets. And that means that they have to be able to sell the products with a surplus. So it's a complicated thing to change that, but I guess it is needed. And many of these territorial markets or local markets, they are informal and sort of often fly under the radar. And that is also where most poor people buy the food. And there have been examples in countries that policies and decisions have been taken that undermine these informal markets and more favor the formal markets. And that's also mentioned in reports. I just think there is a need to put a lot of focus on these informal markets, as they're not always enough recognized by decision makers. And I think supporting these informal markets will likely decrease dependence on food imports. So I think that is one perspective that I would like to bring up. And it's a lot about getting better linkages between farmers, markets, and consumers. And I think universities and academia can contribute there. I also read with great interest, I think it was the recommendation number 6, that highlighted research and training. I think academia and universities play a great role there. And it's not only about creating new science and new science-based knowledge, it's also about how to make best use of the science that we have. You know, as researchers, I can just talk for myself. I was trained in doing research, but received very little training in how to translate the research results into practice and policy. So we must not just be happy with producing and publishing results, but also take them from there. So these links need to be strengthened, I think. So translating the science into practice is crucial to contribute to sustainable and productive agriculture. And that is mentioned here as agroecology. And I think that can be an important way of reducing the negative effect on COVID on food security and nutrition. And it's not only about translating this science into practice, but also into policies. So well-informed decisions can be taken. And that is urgently needed during this pandemic, as we need to speed up the transformation of the agricultural systems. And this is the same case here, that researchers, we have often very little experience in engaging in policy development and policy processes, but it could also be the opposite, that policy makers have little experience in collaborating and with researchers and making best use of the science-based knowledge. So these are two gaps, I think, that need to be addressed, and I think universities and academia have a very important role in this. Let me say, yeah, I just wanted to reflect on some. I have a general comment on the emerging body of scientific literature concerning COVID and effect of food security, food production, agri-food businesses, and that's been touched upon a little by Shakuntala as well. There is a colleague of mine here at SLU, Dr. Assem Abuhatab, and he investigated risk perceptions and determinants of in agri-food enterprises now during the COVID-19 pandemic. And his group identified some limitations that I think are relevant for for also other areas connected to the COVID pandemic. That is that currently the bulk of literature is now focused on issues in high-income countries, while there is still a lack of research based on experience in low-income countries. And I think that really shows the need to support research prioritized by researchers in low-income countries, and this needs to be support also at among the international communities with help with funding and so forth. And much of the literature that is available focus on the in the latter parts of the food system chains, perhaps more on the consumer behaviors and the perceptions. And there is more anecdotal evidence on the impact on the pandemic on individual stages and actors in the food supply chain. And I think that is important also when regards to the recommendation, for example, on strengthening the territorial markets, that we need to do more research, make sure that we do research along the whole food system and not focusing on certain parts of it. And I have two final comments that I would like to make. That to fight COVID and also other food security challenges, it's crucial to reinforce international partnership. We need to work close together more than ever, and to make sure that the university and academia in the most hardest hit countries are involved, because these researchers and academics, they are the ones that are the real experts, and they are the ones that know what information and data is needed in their countries to contribute to food security. And I also would like to raise what also was lifted up in the report, the need to have a holistic approach, and in my world we call it having a One Health approach, and there are different elements that can be included in that, but it really pinpoints and recognize the interconnected nature of food systems with health system, environmental systems, and the economic system. And that is an approach that has put more focus on the last year, and I think that's really the way we need to work to be able to tackle these complex challenges we're facing, and especially now in the shadow of the COVID pandemic. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to more discussion and some reflections.
Thank you very much, Sophia. I will leave open to you, Shantala, to comment on it. I just want to make sure that it's 7 minutes to 9 o'clock, and I promise to wrap up at 9, the official part. And then we have, let's say, another 30 minutes for, if you want to stick around and then to continue the discussion more on let's say, on an informal basis, as we would do perhaps around a cup of coffee if we were to meet in person. But I want to make sure that we could wrap it up in time for 9 o'clock as well, for people to leave to go to other meetings. But I guess, Shantala, that you would like to comment perhaps on Sophia's idea. I heard you were talking about this One Health aspect and stuff. So please jump in here.
Thank you. There are 2 points that I'll just stick to 2 points that Sophia mentioned that I'd like to comment on. And the first one was this about the role of science, the role of researchers, and how researchers link with practitioners, with policymakers, and with policymakers both at international level and at governmental level. So if you would look at, and especially when you talk about people-centered solutions, it's striking how that the information we have is so poor. And this is where researchers really can play a role. If I look at even we talk so much about the role of women in food security and nutrition. And if I would go to a place like Malawi or Zambia, where fish processing is so very important, and I just want to know, how many women are engaged in fish processing, and if we would come in with a solution from sun drying to solar drying, how many will be affected? It's impossible. So that's where I think that researchers can play play a role in bringing in those data, both quantitative and qualitative data. And I think we can really press ourselves that when we do research, especially in low-income and middle-income countries, that we always create a team where we have researchers from different sectors with different disciplines, but also from different countries, and that also in writing up the research findings and coming with the recommendations, to include policymakers within this team that does the writing and publishes the data. I think that would go really a long way. We still are too close and work within our groups, and when we want to do a piece of research, we just find those we work really with, and we do not broaden out to others. I think we can play a bigger role in that. And yes, surely One Health is going to be, I can see it now, and I can see the way that the One Health approach is being of animal health, environmental health, human health, but even expanded to social and economic health. But as yet, our understanding of this approach is very limited. And I do think, again, that within universities and research institutions, we have a role to play. We can begin by making sure it's a big part of the curriculum. That's an easy place to start. But then bringing in this and making sure, for example, if when we talk with our compatriots in CEDA or other agencies where funding is given for research and development, that this aspect is brought into the funding streams. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Excellent, thanks. Gosh, it's always about how to plan the time. We get some really interesting questions from the audience as well, but I still want to make sure that we could wrap up in time. So I would like to perhaps say thank you for this session, and then we will have 2 minutes just to stretch our legs, and then we can continue with the discussion. We have a couple of questions regarding the supply chains, long or short chains, etc. But I think it's very important to leave people in time for if they have other obligations at 9 o'clock. But by saying that, I think to wrap up a little bit, I wish we will do a round later on. But I think you said something, Shakuntala, about more frustration and less hope. But I'm thinking that I hope to give you, if we could create teams and we could address this from different angles as a system, then I'm really hoping that we could use this frustration to create more hope and really some resilient actions as well. But please stay, gosh, it's like a radio, stay tuned. But I'm hoping, give us just a couple of minutes, stretch your legs, and then we will meet back again. And the cliffhanger is some really interesting questions that you can see in the chat as well. So 2 minutes, so that would be, what is that exactly, like 2 minutes past 9 o'clock.
Thank you, I'll be back.
Thank you so very much.